"Take that off." The words landed like a gavel strike, sharp, deliberate, designed to carry across every inch of the room. Colonel Charlotte Weston did not look up from her files immediately. She let the silence do the work first, the way a surgeon lets the blade do the cutting before the hand even moves. When she finally raised her eyes, they traveled the full length of the JAG courtroom, past the 43 people seated in pressed uniforms and civilian attire, past the American flag standing rigid in the corner under fluorescent light that made everything look a little more clinical than it needed to, and landed on the woman standing alone at the defendant's table. The woman was small. That was the first thing anyone noticed. Tulsa. She stood at the center of JAG Building 7, Naval Air Station Coronado, at 0830 on a Tuesday morning in November, wearing the pale blue scrubs of a hospital floor nurse. No rank insignia, no medals, no counsel seated beside her. Just a thin woman with her hands clasped in front of her and a single manila envelope on the table where a stack of legal documentation should have been. On her left wrist, barely visible against the fabric of the scrub cuff, a patch, no bigger than a quarter. Black, no visible insignia, the kind of thing you'd overlook completely unless you were specifically looking, which Colonel Weston was. "You're a nurse." The colonel's voice was perfectly level, which somehow made it worse. "Not a warrior. Take that off." Someone in the gallery exhaled a short laugh, then another, the kind of sound that spreads not because something is genuinely funny, but because someone with authority has signaled that mockery is permissible. The woman at the defendant's table, Iris, according to the single name placard Caleb the court NCO had placed there precisely at 0800, did not look up. She did not look around. She reached her right hand across her body, peeled the patch from her cuff with 2 fingers, and set it flat on the table in front of her. No anger, no tremor, no reaction at all, really. Just stillness, the specific, intentional kind that most people in that room had never encountered and therefore could not name. At the back of the gallery, in the last row of seats, a man in a charcoal civilian suit sat with a small notebook open across one knee. He had not been introduced. He had not been asked to sign in. He had simply been there when Caleb unlocked the doors at 0755, already seated, hands loose in his lap, looking at nothing in particular. He had salt and pepper hair cut close to the scalp, a jaw that suggested decades of early mornings, and the kind of stillness that mirrored the defendant's own, though no one had noticed that yet. When the patch came off the nurse's wrist, his pen stopped moving over the page. His eyes, gray and unhurried, tracked the small square of black fabric as it was set down on the defendant's table. He looked at it for a long moment. Then he wrote something in his notebook slowly and said nothing. Naomi, the court secretary seated to the left of the bench, fingers poised over her transcription keys, marked the time, 0832. She noted the colonel's instruction. She noted the defendant's compliance. She did not note, because there was no official category for it, that the way the defendant had removed the patch was not the way a person removes something they are ashamed of. It was the way a person sets down a weapon they have chosen not to use yet. But Naomi noticed. She marked it in the secondary record she had been keeping for 4 months in a personal file on her personal laptop, which she carried to court every morning inside a standard-issue navy blue bag that no one had ever asked to search. "This hearing," Colonel Weston announced, pulling her reading glasses down from the bridge of her nose, as though seeing the room clearly required no optical assistance, "is convened under the authority of the Uniform Code of Military Justice, Article 92, failure to obey a lawful order, and Article 134, conduct prejudicial to good order and discipline." She let the titles sit in the air. "The accused is Iris Torres, registered nurse, civilian employee, Walter Reed National Military Medical Center, currently assigned to Naval Hospital San Diego on temporary rotation." Another pause. "She is not an officer. She is not enlisted. She is, in the most precise terms available to this proceeding, a civilian employee who appears to believe that her personal judgment supersedes that of a 2-star general." Major General Conrad Kingsley sat at the observation table to the right of the bench. He was 61, broad-shouldered, with the kind of face that had learned long ago to reveal nothing. He did not look at the defendant. He looked at a point slightly above and to the right of the bench, the posture of a man who has already decided the outcome of something and is simply waiting for the paperwork to confirm it. His right index finger tapped the table twice, stopped, tapped again. Prosecutor Major Fletcher rose from his table with the smooth economy of a man who had done this many times. He was 43, lean, and possessed of a speaking voice, calibrated to sound reasonable while saying unreasonable things. "Thank you, Colonel." He turned to the gallery. "The government will demonstrate that on the night of October 9th, the accused deliberately and willfully disregarded a direct written order from Major General Kingsley to cease treatment protocols on patient Ward 7 Delta. The accused's actions constituted insubordination, created significant liability for this installation, and, the government will argue, were not the impulsive decision of an overwhelmed nurse, but the premeditated act of someone who believed herself above the chain of command." He said the last phrase the way a prosecutor says a phrase he has practiced, slowly, cleanly, with a slight pause, before the conclusion, so the jury, in this case the assembled witnesses whose professional opinions would inform Weston's recommendation, had time to absorb it. Staff Sergeant Mason, assigned as the defendant's courtroom escort, stood 2 feet behind Iris at parade rest. He was 29, with the thick neck and compressed posture of a man who had spent years in rooms where physical presence communicated rank more efficiently than insignia. He had been positioned closer to Iris than protocol required, not close enough to be formally objectionable, close enough to be felt. As Fletcher continued his opening remarks, Mason shifted slightly, just enough to bring his right shoulder within inches of Iris's left. An old technique. She did not lean away. She did not adjust her posture. She did not acknowledge his presence in any visible way whatsoever, which was somehow more unsettling than if she had. Captain Ethan Walsh, JAG, counsel for the installation, sat at the far right of the legal table. He was 31, brown-haired, and had the slightly distracted expression of someone running calculations he had not been given all the variables for. He had been assigned to this proceeding as a neutral legal observer, which in practice meant he had no authority to object, but could flag procedural anomalies. He had already flagged 2 in his notes since 0830. He turned the cap of his pen over in his fingers, 3 rotations, a habit he was not aware of, and watched the defendant's face while Fletcher spoke. She was listening. He could tell because her head was absolutely still, the way a person goes still when they are not just hearing words but processing them, cataloging them, filing them, measuring the distance between what is being said and what is true. Most defendants in this room, in his experience, either looked frightened or looked defiant. She looked like neither. She looked like someone sitting through a weather report for a storm they had already survived. In the gallery's 3rd row, Lavender Park, deputy charge nurse, Naval Hospital San Diego, and the only other medical staff member to have been present during the events of October 9th. Sat with her hands folded in her lap and her eyes moving between the colonel and the defendant in a pattern that could only be described as protective anxiety. She was 38, Vietnamese American, with the contained bearing of someone who had learned early that visible emotion in institutional settings was a liability. She had submitted a written statement. She had been told it would not be entered into this proceeding at this stage. She was here anyway. If you're watching this and thinking something doesn't add up about this nurse, you're right. There's a reason Iris hasn't said a single word to defend herself, and it's not fear. Before this hearing goes any further, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because what's coming in the next few minutes is going to completely reframe everything you just saw. Thousands of viewers already figured out the twist. Don't get left behind. Subscribe now and stay with us. Colonel Weston had by 0845 read Iris's personnel file into the record with a particular kind of attention that transformed biography into indictment. Age 34, registered nurse. 7 years at Walter Reed, no combat training on record, no active duty designation, no security clearance above standard employee baseline. A pause, which was doing a great deal of work in this proceeding. You are, in the most precise terms, a civilian employee of the Department of the Navy, which makes the question of how you came to override a general officer's written order not merely a disciplinary matter, but something considerably more interesting. The word interesting carried the specific inflection of a word that means its opposite. Fletcher called his first witness, Dr. Raymond Holt, senior attending physician, Naval Hospital San Diego, who had been on call the night of October 9th. Doctor Holt was 60, with the careful manner of a man reading from a prepared script while trying to look like he wasn't. He testified that Iris had refused to comply with established treatment protocols, had acted outside the scope of her role and training, and had created significant confusion and procedural disruption on Ward 7 Delta. Ethan Walsh wrote the word prepared in his notes and underlined it. At the gallery's far end, Sergeant First Class Asher Cole sat in the second row. He was 32, African American, with a left knee that he held at a slightly different angle than the right, the residue of an injury he never discussed. He was the patient from Ward 7 Delta. He was here because he had been told he might be called to testify. He listened to Dr. Holt's description of the events of October 9th and pressed his lips together once, briefly, the way a person does when they hear a story about themselves that they do not recognize. Dr. Holt concluded. Weston thanked him. As he returned to his seat, Fletcher moved to introduce physical evidence, a card of files, an exhibit board, and a tablet loaded with surveillance footage from Ward 7 Delta. Mason, navigating around the defendant's table to retrieve the exhibit cart, miscalculated, or chose not to calculate, the clearance needed between his passage and the edge of the table. His hip caught the manila envelope Iris had placed there. It slid off the table and landed on the floor. Iris bent down to retrieve it. The movement was automatic, compact, and, to anyone who happened to be watching with the right frame of reference, entirely wrong for the context. She did not reach down and fumble. She did not crouch awkwardly. She dropped into a low one-knee position, retrieved the envelope, and rose in a single fluid motion that lasted perhaps 1 second, and that bore no resemblance whatsoever to how a hospital floor nurse picks something up off a floor. Naomi stopped typing. Her fingers rested on the keys for a full 3 seconds before resuming. In the back row, the man in the charcoal suit wrote 2 words in his notebook and drew a small circle around them. Weston began to read from Iris's personnel history with the focused energy of someone who believed they were delivering a final argument. Born in Laredo, Texas, father unknown, state care from age 9, GED completion at 17, community college nursing program, 7 years of clinical service, no disciplinary record prior to October 9th. She removed her glasses entirely now, looking directly at the defendant. Your record, Ms. Torres, is that of a competent, unremarkable civilian employee who, for reasons this hearing intends to fully understand, decided on one particular evening to act as though the chain of command did not apply to her. Lavender Park's hands tightened in her lap. Iris looked straight ahead. The fluorescent light above the defendant's table was slightly brighter than the others, a maintenance irregularity that had the effect of illuminating the defendant more sharply than the surrounding space, as if the room itself had been staged for examination. She stood in that light and received Weston's summary of her origins without any visible alteration of expression. But her posture, and this was the thing that Ethan Walsh was now watching with growing attention, had changed in one specific way since the hearing began. Her shoulders were precisely and symmetrically level. Her chin was parallel to the floor. Her feet were at a specific angle, approximately 45 degrees apart, weight distributed evenly. It was not the posture of someone standing before a disciplinary board. It was the posture of someone standing at parade rest. Ethan tapped his pen on the table. 1, 2, 3. He looked at his notes. Dr. Angela Heather, Colonel, Medical Corps, was called as the prosecution's expert witness on clinical standards. She was 55, silver-haired, and delivered her testimony with the particular confidence of someone who has occupied authority long enough to wear it as a second skin. She cited protocols, cited standards of care, cited the hierarchy of clinical decision-making in military hospital settings. Her criticism of Iris's actions was technical, precise, and delivered without a single direct look at the defendant. Iris listened. When Heather described a specific hemostatic intervention as outside the scope of standard nursing practice, Iris's head moved slightly, a small downward tilt of perhaps 2 degrees, the movement of someone noting an error in a textbook they have read before. Heather continued. Iris's head returned to its previous position. Asher Cole noticed this. He said nothing, but he noticed it. Silas Mercer arrived at 0912. He had the kind of entrance that was not really an entrance at all. He simply appeared in a seat in the middle gallery that had been empty, as though he had been there for some time, and the room had simply failed to register him. He was 37, lean, with close-cropped dark hair and a quality of attentiveness that the uninitiated might mistake for calm. He wore civilian clothes, gray slacks, a dark jacket, no jewelry, no visible identification. He settled into his seat and looked toward the front of the room. Iris did not look at him, but the angle of her right shoulder dropped precisely half an inch, a movement so small that only someone measuring for it would have registered it, and then returned to its former position. Mason, who had been watching the gallery for authorized personnel, crossed to Silas during a brief procedural pause and asked his name and purpose. "Silas Mercer, former Fleet Marine Force Corpsman, 2nd Marine Division." He said it the way someone reads a memorized address, accurate, specific, and entirely uninteresting. "I'm a civilian now, friend of the family." Mason looked at him for a moment, decided there was nothing to act on, and returned to his position behind Iris. Silas watched the front of the room. Weston called a brief recess at 0930, which was the procedural equivalent of a playwright clearing the stage before an important scene. As the gallery shuffled and rose and the legal teams collected themselves, Ethan Walsh moved to a quieter section of the room and reviewed the 3 points he had flagged in his notes. The first was procedural. The composition of the witness list bore the fingerprints of coordination, every witness serving a unified narrative rather than providing independent testimony. The second was evidentiary. The chain of custody on the written order from Kingsley had a 6-hour gap that had not been addressed. The third was harder to quantify, the kind of thing that a JAG officer with 8 years of experience writes down even when they cannot yet explain it: the defendant's knowledge vocabulary. Twice in the first 40 minutes, once when she corrected Heather's terminology with a barely visible reaction, once when she provided a precise answer to a loaded technical question from Fletcher, Iris had used language that was not on the standard nursing curriculum. Not inaccurate language, precisely accurate language. Language that implied a frame of reference considerably larger than 7 years of clinical work. He looked at the envelope on her table. He looked at the single line of her posture. He wrote a question mark in his notes and moved it to the top of the page. Caleb, the court NCO, 26, quiet, with the deliberate economy of someone who had learned that stillness is a form of information management, moved through the recess with the practiced efficiency of his role, refilling water glasses, repositioning exhibit materials, checking the room's recording equipment. As he passed the back row, he stopped briefly to speak with Silas. No one was close enough to hear. Silas nodded once. Caleb continued toward the exhibit table, retrieved a folder from beneath it, and tucked it under his arm with the other administrative materials he was carrying. His expression did not change. It had not changed since 0755, which Naomi, across the room, noted was somewhat unusual for a court NCO managing a contentious proceeding. She filed this in the secondary document and returned to her main transcription record as Colonel Weston reconvened the hearing at 0947. Fletcher introduced the surveillance footage. The tablet was propped on the exhibit stand, and the footage, 8 minutes and 33 seconds from a Ward 7 Delta Corridor camera, time-stamped 2214 on October 9th, began to play. The footage showed a hospital corridor at night, fluorescent lit, with the reduced staff presence of a late shift. At 2219, Iris appeared at the left edge of the frame. She moved through the corridor at a pace that was, Fletcher noted for the record, distinctly accelerated, suggesting panic. The inference was that she was responding in an uncontrolled manner to a developing situation. Adrenaline response, Weston agreed, looking at the screen, consistent with an impulsive, untrained reaction. In the back row, the man in the charcoal suit watched the screen. The way the nurse moved through that corridor was not the way a panicking person moves. It was the way a person moves when they have already assessed the environment, identified the obstacles, calculated the fastest route that keeps them outside the sightlines of the two individuals visible at the far right of the frame, and are executing on that assessment. The difference was subtle to a civilian. To anyone who had spent significant time watching trained personnel move under pressure, it was not subtle at all. He wrote nothing this time. He simply watched. Fletcher paused the footage at 2221, the moment Iris's hands came into frame as she reached a supply cabinet. Note that the defendant appears to be accessing restricted clinical supplies because, he said, without authorization codes, which the installation records confirm were not entered at that terminal on that evening. Ethan Walsh looked up from his notes. The access logs Fletcher was citing had been provided by Kingsley's office. He had requested independent IT verification 3 days ago. It had not been provided. He opened his mouth. Weston was already speaking. He closed it and wrote the word denied next to the verification request in his notes. Then he drew an arrow from denied to chain of custody gap and sat back. Iris had not turned to look at the footage once. She could not see it from her position at the defendant's table without turning her head. She did not turn her head. She listened to the narrator's voice describing her own actions, and her expression remained the same as it had been at 0830. Weston called Colonel Angela Heather back for a secondary examination. Heather, taking her seat with the precision of someone resuming rather than starting, described in clinical detail why the interventions Iris had performed on the night of October 9th were, in her professional assessment, beyond the reasonable scope of nursing practice in a supervised hospital setting. "Could you describe," Fletcher asked, "the level of specialized knowledge required to perform the specific intervention at issue?" The hemostatic and vascular assessment combination she performed would typically require a minimum of field surgical training, advanced trauma life support certification at the instructor level, and Heather paused, considerable field experience with high acuity injuries. "And does the defendant's personnel record reflect any such training?" "It does not." Ethan looked at Iris. She had just been told, in formal testimony before a senior officer, that she could not have done what she did. She responded to this by folding her hands on the table in a slightly different configuration, right over left rather than left over right. A movement so small it might have been a comfort gesture, except that it was not a comfort gesture. It was the specific finger-lock position of someone managing a strong response without allowing it to surface. Ethan had seen it before. He had seen it in a forward operating base briefing room in 2011. In a staff sergeant who had been ordered to sit quietly while a superior officer misrepresented a patrol report. The staff sergeant had held his hands in exactly that configuration for 40 minutes and had not said a single word. The hearing adjourned for a longer recess at 10:45. As personnel dispersed toward the corridor, Dahlia Cruz, forensic specialist attached to the JAG office for administrative support, gathered her materials near the observer table. She was 41, compact, with reading glasses she wore on a cord around her neck, and an expression of professional neutrality that had, over the past 40 minutes, been experiencing some strain. She moved toward Fletcher's table, leaned in slightly, and said something that made Fletcher go still for a moment, before he shook his head. Kingsley, observing from the observation table, watched this exchange. Dahlia straightened, returned to her seat. Kingsley looked at Weston. Weston gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. Kingsley looked back at the documents in front of him and resumed his expression of patient certainty. In the gallery, Fiona Walsh, no relation to the JAG captain, a fact she had already confirmed with 2 people, military correspondent for the Naval Institute News, sat with a press lanyard and a reporter's notebook. She had been credentialed for this hearing as a media observer. She was 36, experienced, and possessed of the specific professional instinct that had delivered her to interesting rooms before their contents became obvious. She had arrived expecting a routine disciplinary proceeding. She had been here for 2 hours and was no longer expecting that. She had written 3 lines of notes and drawn a box around all 3. The recess ended. Weston returned. The hearing resumed at 11:03. Fletcher moved to the matter of testimony. He called Sergeant First Class Asher Cole to the stand. Asher rose from his seat with the deliberate movement of a man managing physical discomfort he had no intention of announcing. He was the 4th patient on Ward 7 Delta. He was alive because of what Iris had done on October 9th. He had been told, in no uncertain terms by his unit's legal officer, to confine his testimony to direct factual recollection and to avoid characterizations that could be construed as endorsements of the defendant's conduct. He took his seat on the witness stand and looked at Fletcher. Fletcher asked him to describe, in his own words, the events of October 9th as he experienced them. Asher described the evening, the deterioration in his condition, the point at which the on-call physician had not responded to the floor nurse's call within the required window, the moment Iris had entered his room. "And how would you characterize the defendant's behavior at that time?" Fletcher asked. "Calm," Asher said. Fletcher paused. This was not the answer the question was designed to receive. "Could you be more specific?" "She came in, assessed the situation, told me." He stopped, looked at Iris for a moment. She did not look back. He continued. She told me I was not going to die that night. She said it the way someone tells you the weather, like it was a fact she had already checked. Then she started working, and the specific intervention she performed. Were you aware at the time that those exceeded standard nursing protocols? I was aware, Asher said, with a precision that came from someone who had been thinking about this question for a long time, that I was dying, and then I wasn't. That's the extent of what I can personally verify. Weston tapped her gavel once. The witness will limit testimony to observable facts and avoid characterizations that function as legal conclusions. Yes, ma'am? Fletcher tried to redirect. Were you aware of the defendant's specific credentials or training background before the evening of October 9th? No. So you have no basis for assessing whether her actions were appropriate within the scope of... I've been in 3 combat deployments, Major. Asher's voice remained level. I know the difference between someone reacting and someone executing. That's not a characterization. That's an observation. Weston's gavel came down again, sharper. Asher sat back. He had said what he came to say. Lavender Park, watching from the gallery, exhaled slowly through her nose. As Asher was dismissed and returned to his seat, he passed close to the defendant's table. He did not speak to Iris. He did not look at her. But as he passed, he touched the edge of the table once, briefly, a deliberate gesture of contact with the physical space she occupied, the kind of gesture that carries meaning without language. Fletcher moved to the phase of proceedings he had been building toward, the specific technical charges. He requested that the defendant respond to questions regarding her clinical decision-making. Weston granted this. Iris was asked to stand and address the board. She stood. Fletcher asked his first technical question about the specific intervention she had performed, framing it to imply that any competent response would reveal either ignorance or overreach. It was a well-constructed question. It had, Ethan noted, been designed to have no good answer. Iris stood at the whiteboard that had been positioned near the defendant's table for this phase. She picked up the marker. She began to draw. What she drew was not a nursing diagram. It was a vascular anatomy map, the specific territory involved in the October 9th intervention, rendered with the speed and accuracy of someone for whom this was not reconstruction, but recollection. No hesitation. No reference to notes. The details she included, the annotations she made as she drew, were not in any standard nursing curriculum. They were the kind of detail that surfaces in field surgical training, in advanced trauma management courses designed for people who treat injuries in environments without hospitals. She drew for 40 seconds. Fletcher said, "This is not a medical seminar." Iris set the marker down. She returned to the defendant's table. She sat. The incomplete diagram remained on the whiteboard behind her, visible to every person in the room, saying more in its truncated state than a completed version would have said. Ethan looked at it. Then he looked at the personnel file in his folder, the standard file, the official record. Then he looked at Iris. He rotated his pen cap. 1, 2, 3. Dahlia Cruz, at the observer table, had her laptop open. She had stopped watching the front of the room. She was looking at her screen. Her expression, for the first time since the hearing began, was not professionally neutral. It was the expression of someone whose spreadsheet is showing a number that does not match the one they were told to expect. At 11:40, Weston called a brief administrative recess. Personnel rose, stretched, spoke in low voices. Caleb made his passage through the room, collecting materials, redistributing water, managing the space with his particular brand of invisible efficiency. As he passed the observer table, he set a slim folder, manila, unlabeled, at Ethan's seat with the rest of the administrative documents. He did not pause. He did not make eye contact. He moved on. Ethan returned to his seat. He picked up the folder. He opened it. His hand paused on the second page. He read for a moment, closed the folder against his chest, and looked up. His gaze moved across the room, found the man in the charcoal suit in the last row, who was not looking at him. Then his gaze moved to Iris, who was not looking at anyone. Then it moved to the whiteboard with the incomplete vascular diagram. The recess ended. Weston reconvened the hearing at 11:52. Right now you're seeing maybe 30% of who Iris actually is. The other 70% is classified, and it's about to walk straight into this courtroom whether Charlotte is ready for it or not. If this story is hitting different for you, drop a comment below. Did you catch the clue about her hands? And if someone you know needs to hear a story about quiet strength today, share this video with them right now. Keep watching. Fletcher's next witness was a Dr. Marcus Pryor, brought from Bethesda specifically to testify regarding Iris's competency record. Dr. Pryor testified that Iris lacked the qualifications to make independent clinical decisions of the type performed on October 9th. He was thorough. He was credentialed. He was, Ethan noted, careful in the specific way that people are careful when they are saying something they have agreed to say. Fletcher then turned to Iris with the question the prosecution had been staging toward for the better part of 2 hours. Ms. Torres, can you explain how you possess the knowledge to perform the interventions you performed on October 9th, given that your training record does not reflect the relevant certifications? Iris was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I've read widely, Major." 3 words. Flat, unadorned, delivered with the confidence of someone who knows that 3 words can carry more weight than 300 when the room is listening for them. Weston's expression shifted, a small movement at the corner of her mouth that suggested satisfaction. She had mistaken the answer for an admission of improvisation, a civilian's defense. Fletcher moved on to the evidence against Kingsley's order, or rather, to the government's framing of the evidence, which positioned Iris's actions as willful defiance rather than clinical necessity. He introduced a second set of documents, the written order from Kingsley dated October 9th, time-stamped 2145, directing the cessation of escalated treatment on all Ward 7 Delta patients pending administrative review. Ethan looked at the chain of custody information on the document header. He looked at the 6-hour gap he had flagged at 0830. He looked at the date and timestamps on the 3 cases that had preceded Asher's, the 3 patients who had not survived Ward 7 Delta in the previous 8 months. He looked at the signatures on those files. All 3 bore Kingsley's signature on the treatment cessation orders. Ethan opened his mouth. His chair scraped slightly. Weston was already speaking, moving to the penalty phase summary, announcing that the government would seek dishonorable discharge, removal of benefits, and potential criminal referral to the U.S. Attorney's Office. In the gallery, Lavender Park brought both hands to her mouth. A young corpsman 2 seats down looked at her, then at the defendant, then at the floor. Asher Cole pressed his hand flat against the surface of his chair arm and held it there. Ethan closed his mouth. He looked at the folder Caleb had placed at his seat. He looked at the whiteboard. He looked at Iris. She was sitting with perfect stillness in the bright fluorescent light of JAG Building 7, and she looked exactly like what they said she was. A small, unremarkable civilian nurse, alone, without resources, without allies, without defense. And she looked to anyone watching with the right kind of attention, absolutely unafraid. Outside the building, the November sun over San Diego was sharp and low, the kind of clear, cold light that makes everything look more definite than it is. Through the single narrow window above the gallery's east wall, it reached the floor of JAG Building 7 in a narrow stripe that fell, by the geometry of the room's layout, directly across the defendant's table, across the small square of black fabric that Iris had set down at the beginning of the hearing. The fabric lay there, undisturbed, through all of it. Naomi was still typing. The man in the charcoal suit had stopped writing, and Ethan Walsh, JAG captain, legal observer, holder of 1 manila folder and several questions he could not yet answer, had just made a decision. He was going to flag a procedural objection, whether Colonel Weston wanted to hear it or not. Ethan Walsh had been a JAG officer for 8 years, long enough to understand that the moment you decide to raise a procedural objection in a senior officer's courtroom, you are making a choice whose consequences will extend far beyond the room. He had flagged 3 such objections in his career before this one. 2 had been sustained. The 3rd had earned him a formal reprimand that still lived in an administrative folder somewhere in the JAG Corps system. Patient, permanent, a small monument to the one time he had been right and paid for it anyway. He thought about that folder for approximately 1 second. Then he stood up. "Colonel Weston." His voice was level, and it carried the full width of JAG Building 7 without effort. "I am required to raise a procedural objection." The room registered this the way rooms register unexpected sounds in controlled spaces, a collective pause, a simultaneous interruption of the ambient textures of breath and paper and the building's ventilation hum. 43 people processing the fact that someone had stepped outside the choreography of the proceeding. Weston's gavel came down once, preemptive, sharper than any strike that had preceded it. This hearing is not in a phase that accommodates. Article 32 of the Uniform Code of Military Justice requires that all evidence entered into a formal proceeding carry a verified chain of custody. Ethan opened the folder Caleb had placed at his seat. He laid it flat on the table with both hands, planting something, staking a position. The chain of custody documentation for the written order attributed to Major General Kingsley, dated October 9th, contains a 6-hour gap between its stated time of issuance and its official logging in the installation's administrative system. I flagged this discrepancy in my pre-hearing review 3 days ago and submitted a formal request for independent IT verification. That verification was not provided before this hearing, and it was not provided during it. He paused. One beat. Deliberate. The government has now used that document as the evidentiary foundation for a penalty recommendation that includes dishonorable discharge and criminal referral. I am raising this on the formal record because it is my legal obligation to do so. That is the function of this role. I am performing it. The silence that followed had its own temperature. Cold, and Weston was its source. She looked at Ethan with the concentrated management-oriented attention of a woman who had spent 22 years in proceedings and who understood completely what had just happened and what the available responses to it were and what each would cost. Captain Walsh, she said, the rank carrying the weight of a longer sentence that had been surgically compressed. Your designated role does not extend to, with respect, Colonel, it extends to exactly this. He stood his ground with the physical stillness of someone who had rehearsed uncomfortable positions until the discomfort became irrelevant. I am a legal observer assigned by the JAG Corps. What I am observing is a chain of custody irregularity that would render this hearing's outcome challengeable at every appellate level available to the defendant under both military and federal law. I am not asking you to halt proceedings. I am asking that the objection be entered into the formal record, a request I have both the authority and the obligation to make. Kingsley's right index finger had stopped its quiet rhythm against the observation table. The absence of that small sound was, in the specific silence of that moment, more noticeable than the sound had ever been. Fletcher had set his pen down and was examining the middle distance with the focused blankness of a man whose calculations have just encountered an unexpected variable. From the east wall of the gallery, from the chair that most of the room had, over 3 hours, quietly stopped registering as occupied, a figure stood. Levi Drake was 39 and lean, with the economic bearing of someone whose training had spent considerable time removing unnecessary motion from his behavioral repertoire. He wore a dark suit with no tie and produced from his jacket a credentials case, which he held open at his side as he spoke. Colonel Weston, my name is Levi Drake. I'm a special agent with the Naval Criminal Investigative Service. I have been present in this building since 0740 this morning under NCIS operational authorization. He held his credentials at reading distance without ceremony. The IT verification request submitted by Captain Walsh was received by the installation's records office at 14:30 hours on Friday. It was logged, it was not processed, and was not forwarded to Captain Walsh. He lowered the credentials. Captain Walsh's objection reflects a concern that my office has independently identified in our pre-hearing review. I want the record to reflect that it is not the only concern my office has identified. The room had moved, in 90 seconds, into territory no one had anticipated when the hearing convened at 0830. Weston looked at the credentials. She looked at Ethan's folder. She looked at the bench with the expression of a senior officer running very fast arithmetic on very limited variables. The objection, she said, and the flatness of it was the sound of compressed pressure, is noted for the record. The chain of custody matter is referred to administrative review pending conclusion of these proceedings. She lifted her gavel. We will continue? Ethan wrote noted in his folder. He circled it. It was not the outcome he had wanted. It was a flag planted in ground, not the same as holding that ground, but the necessary precondition for doing so, and he understood the difference. Weston pressed forward with the focused momentum of someone who knows that the value of momentum lies in its continuity. She moved to the phase in which the defendant would address the board. Ms. Torres, she said, the civilian honorific precise and deliberate, carrying the full weight of the diminishment it was designed to perform. You may address the board. Iris stood. The room watched her stand, this small, quiet woman in the pale blue scrub top with the torn shoulder seam, alone at the defendant's table since 0830, through 3 hours of testimony constructed to establish she was exactly what she appeared to be. She stood straight, level, unhurried, hands at her sides rather than on the table, producing a posture that was not the posture of someone addressing a disciplinary board, but the posture of someone standing at report. She looked at the exhibit board, at the access logs, the treatment records, the chain of custody documentation, at the written order bearing Kingsley's name, time-stamped 2145, that had been presented as the foundation of everything the government had built against her. She looked at it for one moment with the specific attention of someone reading a document they have read many times and are reading again now with full awareness of what it actually contains. "I'd like to make 3 corrections to the evidentiary record," she said. Fletcher was on his feet immediately. "Colonel, the defendant does not have the procedural standing to—" "She has the floor." Weston said it briefly, and the subtext was clear. She was granting this because she had already won, and winning completely meant allowing the opposition to exhaust itself in the open. "Continue." Iris turned slightly, not quite facing the bench, not quite facing the gallery, positioning herself so her voice reached both simultaneously. "The first correction concerns the clinical protocols I applied on October 9th. Colonel Heather characterized them as outside standard nursing practice. That characterization is inaccurate. The hemostatic and vascular assessment combination I applied is documented in the updated Naval Medical Training Institute Trauma Management Supplement, revised in 2014 following the Kandahar Field Hospital Protocol Review, incorporated into the Advanced Clinical Training Syllabus the following year. The protocols are not extraordinary. They are not outside standard military medical practice. They are outside the pre-revision framework Colonel Heather cited, the 2012 version. In the witness area, Colonel Angela Heather looked up from her notes. Her expression had the particular quality of a face receiving information while simultaneously recalibrating the positions it has been occupying. The specific expression of professional reassessment conducted at speed. "The second correction concerns the 3 patients who preceded Sergeant Cole on Ward 7 Delta," Iris said, each name with the full weight of its specificity. "Corporal David Morrow, Sergeant First Class Teresa Grant, Petty Officer Second Class James Alton." She gave each its own moment. Each died following a cessation of treatment order signed by Major General Kingsley. Each order was issued within a 12-hour window of a scheduled administrative review that would have escalated their cases to advanced intervention protocols. The timeline across all 3 cases is identical. Nursing staff documentation of deterioration, escalation flags submitted through standard channels, cessation of treatment order issued from administrative command, patient death within 24 hours of order compliance. She looked at the exhibit board. "I am not characterizing the clinical cause of their deaths. I am describing the documented administrative sequence that preceded each one. That sequence is in this installation's own records. It was not included in the evidentiary package presented to this hearing." The ventilation system was very loud. No one had noticed it being loud before, but the room had arrived at a quality of silence in which it was the dominant sound, the mechanical, indifferent breath of the building filling the space that human sound had vacated. Kingsley was looking at the surface of the exhibit table, not at Iris, not at Weston, not at any of the people in the room. He was looking at the table with the focused inward attention of a man who is not avoiding eye contact, but is engaged in a very specific kind of private accounting, running new numbers and beginning to understand where they are going to land. "The third correction," Iris said, and something in the specific patience of how she said the word, the absolute absence of theater, caused several people in the gallery to stop breathing without being aware of it, "concerns the written order itself. The order was received at the Ward 7 Delta nursing station at 2203 on October 9th. My intervention began at 2219. The window between receipt of the order and my first independent clinical action was 16 minutes. She looked at Weston directly. During those 16 minutes, I made 8 separate contact attempts to the on-call attending physician, the senior resident, and the charge nurse supervisor by floor phone and hospital communication system. None were answered. The automatic log of those attempts exists in the hospital system's records. It documents each attempt with its timestamp and outcome. That log was not included in the evidentiary package. She reached for the manila envelope. It had been sitting on the defendant's table since 0830, the single item she had carried into JAG Building 7. When everything else about her position suggested she was carrying nothing, she opened it. She placed on the table, side by side, 2 items: a matte black external drive the size of a thumb, no visible markings, and a single folded sheet of paper. 31 months of documentation, she said. Communication records, treatment logs with verified timestamps, administrative orders across all affected cases, personnel cross-references through the command structure, a complete timeline establishing the pattern I have described. Her right hand rested flat on the drive for one moment, not dramatically, but with the specific deliberateness of someone setting down something they have been carrying for a very long time, and are setting down now precisely in the right place. The authorization for this documentation was granted under a directive from the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The operational case reference is Widow Protocol. The authorization confirmation is on that sheet. Fletcher's hands were flat on his legal table. He was not moving. Levi Drake crossed to the defendant's table in 4 steps, producing from his jacket a sealed evidence bag. He positioned himself beside the drive. Kingsley stood. "This is entirely irregular." His voice had its usual volume, but had lost the underlying texture of certainty that had characterized it all morning. "This hearing has established protocols for the introduction of evidentiary materials. This individual does not have the standing to simply place items on a table, and Admiral Kingsley." The correction of rank, precise, deliberate, using the enlisted grade in a room full of officers, fell into the proceeding the way a stone falls into still water. Kingsley stopped mid-sentence. He turned. The man in the charcoal suit was standing from the last row of the gallery for the first time since 0755. He rose without hurry, without performance, the way a person rises when they have decided the moment has arrived, and there is no longer any reason to wait. 62 years old, compact, standing with feet at shoulder width and hands clasped behind his back in a posture that required no insignia to communicate its nature. He looked at Kingsley across the full length of JAG, Building 7, with an expression that contained no hostility, no performance, and a great deal of the specific gravity that belongs to people for whom consequence is the primary professional currency. Weston looked at him. She had been in enough rooms with enough senior officers to possess a physical recognition for rank that operated below conscious processing. What she was apprehending now produced in her for the first time this morning a visible hesitation. "Sir," she said carefully, "may I ask your—" "Admiral Solomon Vance, Special Operations Command, Joint Advisory Capacity. I have been in this building since 0755. I chose to observe without identifying myself until the appropriate moment." A pause that was not dramatic, but was not short. "That moment is now?" The gallery achieved the quality of a room that has forgotten to breathe. 43 people, the ventilation system, and the weight of what had just been said. "Agent Drake," Solomon said, without shifting his gaze from Kingsley, "please secure the evidentiary materials on the defendant's table." Levi was already there. He began the evidence packaging with the practiced efficiency of someone executing a choreographed step in a sequence planned well before this morning. Weston straightened. She lifted her gavel. "Admiral, with respect, this hearing operates under my authority as presiding officer and the—" "Colonel Weston!" Solomon turned to her, and his voice carried the specific quality that comes from decades of directing operations in which the difference between the right word and the wrong one was not abstract. "The defendant has placed on that table a document bearing the Joint Chiefs Authorization seal under Widow Protocol. That authorization falls under my operational oversight. Before you continue this proceeding in any direction, I strongly recommend you read it." Levi had unfolded the authorization sheet. He held it at reading distance for Weston, and she looked at it, at the seal, at the classification header, at the signature block, and something in her expression, in the architecture of certainty that had been its primary structural feature since 0830, shifted in the way that load-bearing structures shift when the load is removed from one side. Small, irreversible. "This," she began. "The proceeding," Solomon said, and his voice had the finality of a door properly closed, "is over, Colonel." Weston looked at the gavel in her hand. She looked at the room, at Levi securing the evidence, at Ethan with his open folder, at the gallery where people had begun to stand. She placed the gavel on the bench, not with a strike, with both hands flat, setting it down the way a person sets down something they will not pick up again, with the complete and final quality of that particular gesture. She gathered her materials. She walked to the door of JAG Building 7. The door opened. She went through it. It closed behind her with the ordinary sound of a latch engaging, a sound that, in the context of this morning, carried the weight of a period at the end of a very long sentence. The room breathed. What just happened in that courtroom doesn't happen. It's not supposed to be possible, and yet every person in that room just witnessed it. If Iris's story moved you, if you believe real strength never advertises itself, hit like, subscribe, and tell us in the comments, what was the moment you knew? The ending is 60 seconds away. Don't move. From the middle section of the gallery, Silas Mercer stood. He rose without announcement, without the physical performance of significance, simply to his feet, straight, hands at his sides in the correct position. He rendered to the woman at the defendant's table a full, formal military salute, not the casual acknowledgement of peers, the complete, precise, deliberate rendering of military respect. Hand raised to the brow at the correct angle, elbow elevated to the specified height, held for the full required duration, released in the correct sequence. The salute of someone for whom this gesture has been performed 10,000 times in a career, and who means it differently this time than any of those other times. More specifically, more personally, more as an act of witnessed truth than of protocol. Sergeant First Class Asher Cole, in the second row, watched Silas stand. He looked at Iris, at the torn fabric of her scrub top, at the small spider tattoo visible now at her left shoulder, at the woman who had come into his room on the night of October 9th, and told him, in the voice of someone who had already verified the outcome, that he was going to be fine. Something moved through his expression that was not surprise. He had known, in the way that soldiers sometimes know things about people without being able to name the mechanism, that she was not simply what she appeared to be. What moved through his expression now was confirmation, and something older and quieter beneath it, the settling into place of understanding that has been waiting, without knowing it was waiting, for the frame that would finally contain it. He stood. His left knee held the position without visible difficulty, which cost him something, and which he paid without hesitation. He raised his hand. Two officers in the third row stood simultaneously, not signaled, not coordinated, simply responding to the same gravitational recognition that something was occurring in this room that warranted being met on your feet. They rendered their salutes. Then a fourth figure stood. Then two more. The gesture moved through the gallery the way certain gestures do. Not as performance, not as choreography, but as a series of individual decisions that happen to align because the reasoning producing them is the same reasoning, arrived at independently. Colonel Angela Heather stood from the witness area and moved to the center of the room. She stood in the open space between the bench and the defendant's table, and she looked at the gallery, and she spoke without preamble. I need to formally amend my testimony. The room attended to this with the specific quality of attention that follows extraordinary events. The attention of people who have been processing a great deal and are now receiving more, holding each new element against everything that preceded it. The clinical protocols applied by Lieutenant Torres on the night of October 9th are consistent with updated Naval Medical Training Institute standards, Heather said. Each word was placed with the care of someone who understands that words on the record will remain there. I characterize them under oath as outside standard nursing practice. That characterization was not accurate. I knew it was not fully accurate when I stated it. I chose to use the pre-revision framework because it supported the case as it had been structured. That was wrong. She paused. The pause held the specific weight of a professional acknowledging error in public, weight that does not decrease with rank or experience, but rather increases. The record should reflect the accurate clinical picture. The protocols were within established advanced military medical standards. The intervention was correct. She looked at Iris. Iris looked back at her. Between them was the specific, uncomplicated transaction of one person having been wrong about another and saying so. Thank you, Colonel Heather, Iris said. Heather nodded once and returned to her seat. Levi crossed to Kingsley's position. His voice carried neither edge nor accommodation, the voice of institutional authority at its baseline register. Sir, I need to ask you to remain in your seat. My office will need to speak with you regarding the administrative records associated with the treatment cessation orders for Corporal Morrow, Sergeant Grant, and Petty Officer Alton, and regarding the chain of custody documentation for the October 9th written order. He paused. You are not being formally detained at this time. I would strongly recommend voluntary compliance. Kingsley looked at the matte black drive, now secured in Levi's evidence bag. He was a man who had spent a career in institutional structures, understanding how information moves and what it does when it arrives in the wrong hands. He understood what was in that drive from the shape and duration and authorization level of its assembly. The way a doctor understands a diagnosis from the pattern of a scan before reading the specific notation. He sat. He placed both hands flat on the table in front of him. Two additional NCIS agents entered from the corridor, where they had been waiting since 0800. They crossed to Levi's position and received the evidence materials with the practiced efficiency of a transfer that had been choreographed before the morning began. The drive, the authorization sheet, the chain of custody documentation, the original evidentiary package. Each item logged, bagged, signed. Solomon crossed to the defendant's table. He came without ceremony, without the weight of occasion. He was simply a 62-year-old man walking to the table of a woman who had saved his life 8 years ago, and to whom he had not, in any of the ways that mattered, been able to speak directly until now. He stopped at the edge of the table and looked at Iris, and his expression was the expression of someone who has arrived at a destination they have been moving toward for a long time, and who is present for the arrival, without pretense. 8 years ago, he said, and his voice was pitched now for the room. 6 SEAL operators were captured during a compromised intelligence operation outside Kandahar Province, Sector 7. The political sensitivity of their presence in denied territory made any acknowledged rescue impossible. Official assessment concluded extraction was not viable. He paused. The room was absolutely still. A solo asset, operating under a classification level above this installation, above the operational command of the team itself, conducted an unsanctioned extraction. She went in alone. She brought 6 operators out under fire. All 6 were recovered alive. She sustained significant injuries during the operation and treated them herself in the field. She refused medical evacuation until every operator was confirmed safe. He looked at Iris. I was one of those 6. He looked at the tattoo at her shoulder. The spider, black and precise, the hourglass in dark red at its center. And he did not look away. I heard your voice that night, he said, telling me I was not going to die. A pause. I have been listening for that voice for 8 years. Silas Mercer came to the table. He moved the way he had moved all morning, without announcing himself, occupying space rather than entering it. He reached into his jacket and produced a coin. Challenge coin, standard military dimensions. He set it on the table in front of Iris. She looked at it. One side, a unit marking she recognized as completely as she recognized her own name. The designation of a unit whose official title appeared in no publicly cataloged organizational chart. The other side, a date, August 12, 2009, Kandahar. We voted that same week, Silas said. All 6 of the operators you brought out, and me because I ran your exfil support. 7 votes, unanimous. You were supposed to have it before the month was out. The handler who processed the post-mission documentation didn't pass it forward. His voice was even. We tried twice to correct it through official channels. Both times it was stopped somewhere in the administrative structure before it reached you. He looked at the coin. We found out later why. I imagine that's in your drive. Iris picked the coin up. She felt the weight of it, the physical weight of a small metal disc, and the other weight that had nothing to do with metal or dimensions, the compressed weight of a vote taken by 7 people in the aftermath of the most difficult night of her operational life. A vote that said, you were here, you mattered, you belong to this. She closed her hand around it. Thank you, Silas, she said. He nodded once. He stepped back and gave the space to the room. Ethan Walsh came forward with the folder Caleb had delivered to his seat. He stood at the edge of the defendant's table with the expression of a man who is aware he is in the presence of something considerably larger than his ordinary work and is calibrating his response to that awareness. Commander, he said, using the rank now with the ease of a word that has always been the correct one. The 3 prior cases, the prosecutorial referral will need formal legal counsel with the clearance level to access the operational record and present it across both military tribunal and federal civilian jurisdiction simultaneously. He paused. I want to be part of that, not peripherally. I want to build the legal framework from the foundation. Iris looked at him. She had been watching Ethan Walsh for 3 hours. She had watched him flag the chain of custody discrepancy when he had no certainty of support. She had watched him stand up and stay standing when it was uncomfortable. What she had observed in the pattern of these things was reliable. "You'll need a clearance upgrade," she said. "Standard processing runs approximately 3 weeks." "I'll apply tonight," he said, without hesitation. "While it processes, the administrative anomalies I described this morning are in the installation's own public systems. They don't require operational clearance to access. They require someone with the methodological precision to understand what they're looking at." She paused. "You clearly have that." He returned to his table and opened both folders simultaneously, already working. Lavender Park came through the gallery rail with the uncertain movement of someone who is not sure they belong in the space they are entering, but has decided the question of belonging is less important than the fact of being here. She stopped in front of the defendant's table and looked at Iris with an expression that was holding a complicated arrangement of feelings and doing its best to organize them. "7 years," she said. "I thought I knew you." "You did," Iris said. "Not all of you." "No, not all." A pause. "The work was real. Every morning, every patient, every code called at 3 in the morning. And that was real. The person who showed up for those things was real. The care was not operational." She paused again. "The rest was a cover, but you were never part of the cover. You were a colleague, and you were honest, and you were good at your work. And those things were just true." Lavender absorbed this. "I kept thinking during the hearing that I should be doing something," she said. "Standing up or speaking but every time I thought about it, you were so steady, like you didn't need it." "I didn't need it in the way you meant," Iris said. "But having you there, knowing that someone in the room was present because they chose to be, that was different. That was not nothing." Lavender pressed her lips together briefly. She nodded. "Okay," she said. She meant several things by it, none requiring specification. She returned to the gallery and sat down in one of the empty chairs and stayed, not because anything remained to observe, but because she was not ready to leave a room in which something of this significance had happened. You get only a certain number of mornings like this one in a life. You do not hurry through them. Naomi, at the court secretary's station, completed the official transcript and saved it to the 4 automatic archiving locations that formal JAG proceedings required. Then she opened her secondary document, the parallel record she had maintained for 4 months, alongside the official one, in the same way a careful person sometimes keeps 2 accounts of the same period, one for the record and one for the truth. She read the final entries and wrote one more. Conclusion note: the defendant was correct in every material fact she stated. The proceeding concluded not because the institution recognized its error, but because it was forced to confront evidence it could not contain. The record will reflect the official outcome. This document reflects what I observed. She saved it to 3 locations, folded a single sheet of paper with a handwritten note, and walked it to Levi Drake. He read it. He looked at her. "How long have you been keeping the secondary record?" 4 months, she said. "Since the second pre-hearing review session, when the witness preparation documentation showed signs of coordination inconsistent with independent testimony." "How did you know something was wrong from the beginning?" Naomi looked toward the defendant's table, at its empty surface, the manila envelope gone, the patch gone, the drive gone. "The way she placed the patch on the table," she said. "When Colonel Weston ordered her to remove it, she took it off and put it down in the center of the table, in plain sight. Someone afraid of what it represented would have hidden it. Someone ashamed would have pocketed it." She paused. "She put it where everyone could see it. That is not what afraid people do. I started the secondary record that afternoon." She produced from her bag a sealed envelope, 8 pages of precisely formatted documentation, her formal witness statement. She held it out. "I thought it would be useful to have it ready." Levi took it. He looked at it, then at her. "Thank you," he said. She returned to her station. Asher Cole was the last person to approach the table before Iris prepared to leave. He came across the empty gallery with the deliberate economy of a man managing a permanent physical reminder of a day he was not supposed to survive, and he stopped at the table without beginning a speech, because he had not prepared one. "Commander," he said, "Sergeant Cole, on October 9th, I knew the numbers. I've been in enough situations to understand what the trajectory looks like when it's not good." He paused. "You came in and you looked at the numbers and you said they were wrong. Then you made them wrong, and you were right to do it." He held her gaze. "There is something specific about a person who looks at an outcome the institution has decided is fixed and decides on their own authority that the outcome is not acceptable and that they are going to change it. Another pause. I know what kind of person you are. I'm glad to know it formally now. You stayed present while I worked, Iris said. A lot of people don't stay with you while you work. That mattered. He rendered a final salute, precise, full, deliberate. She returned it with the same precision, the specific military grammar of mutual respect, brief and exact. It said everything that needed to be said. He turned and walked out. At the door, he looked back at the room once, at the empty bench, the whiteboard with its incomplete diagram, the arrangement of chairs that had held the morning's events, with the expression of a person committing a space to memory, not because the space was significant, but because of what had occurred in it. Then the door closed behind him, and his footsteps diminished down the corridor, and were gone. Solomon stood beside Iris at the table. He came without performance, simply a person who has arrived at a specific moment in relation to another person, and who is not entirely sure he has the right language for what the moment requires. 31 months, he said. 23 solo, she said. The contact structure was compromised in month 8. I operated without check-ins for the subsequent period. He was quiet for a moment, processing this with the bodily comprehension of someone who understands it not theoretically, but physically. The specific texture of what that cost, and what it took to keep paying it daily without any confirmation that the account was still being tracked. Why the courtroom? He said finally. Why not a direct submission? Because the compromise went higher than my mission handler. She looked at the bench, at the empty space where Weston had stood for 3 hours, conducting a proceeding she believed she controlled. I needed the documentation to enter the official record through a channel the compromise parties could not intercept before it was formally logged. A formal JAG hearing creates an automatic record simultaneously copied to 4 independent archives at the moment of formal introduction. Once the drive was placed on this table and identified on the transcript, it existed in 4 locations simultaneously, none accessible to anyone below Joint Chief's level. She looked at him. The hearing wasn't a liability, it was the mechanism. Solomon was quiet for a longer moment. He was looking at this woman. At the torn fabric of her scrub top, at the tattoo at her shoulder, at the 7 years of cover identity, and 31 months of active penetration work, and 3 hours of sitting in a courtroom, listening to her own history weaponized against her, and the absolute, unbroken control with which she had navigated every minute of it, and thinking about the distance between what a person appears to be and what they are, and what that distance had cost, and what it had produced. There's one more thing, he said. He reached into his jacket and produced a small folded sheet. Not official, smaller than anything procedural, unofficial in its dimensions. He placed it on the table. After Kandahar, after you brought us out, each of the 6 wrote down something they would have said to you if they had been able to make contact. The asset designation prevented official follow-up, so they wrote them down and I kept them. He looked at the sheet. That is all 6. I've been carrying it for 8 years. Iris looked at the sheet. She did not pick it up immediately. She looked at it for a moment with an expression that was the closest thing to visible emotion she had permitted herself all morning. Not the performance of emotion, but its quiet, actual presence, surfacing briefly through the years of trained containment that had kept it below the surface. She picked it up. She held it. She did not open it. "Thank you, sir," she said. "No," he said, simply. "Thank you, Lieutenant." They stood in the quiet of the mostly empty room for a moment that did not require anything additional from either of them. Then he said, "DEVGRU has a position, direct action team, no cover designation, no distance between who you are and what the record says." He paused. "I think you have been carrying a version of yourself that is not the complete version for long enough." She looked at the narrow east window. The November light had moved across 3 hours of morning into the specific quality of late morning in San Diego. Sharper now, lower, the strip of bay visible between roof lines beyond the glass, cold and blue. 31 days, she said, to close the operational file, brief the continuity contacts. Ensure the documentation chain for the medical cases is sufficiently established then that it doesn't depend on my testimony to proceed. You have 60. 31 is sufficient. He looked at her for a moment with an expression that was somewhere between respect and argument, and something belonging to neither precisely, the expression of a person who recognizes They are not going to win this point, and accepts it without fully conceding it. 31 days, he said. She nodded once. He collected his notebook and his jacket from the last row of the gallery and left JAG Building 7 the way he had entered it that morning, quietly, before anyone had been paying attention. Iris stood alone at the table. The room was quiet now in the way rooms are quiet after they have held something significant, settled, the furniture of the morning arranged in the aftermath of its use. The whiteboard behind the defendant's table still held the incomplete vascular diagram she had drawn, the precise lines, the truncated annotations, the picture that had been interrupted before it was finished. Caleb was moving through the room restoring order, replacing chairs, removing exhibit stands. He reached the whiteboard. He looked at the diagram for one moment, then erased it with 2 clean sweeps. The lines disappeared. The board was white and ready for the next proceeding, which would know nothing of what had been drawn on it this morning. Iris gathered the items remaining on the table. The challenge coin went in her left pocket. The folded patch, she retrieved it from the edge of the exhibit table where it had ended up during the evidence transfer. She turned over in her fingers. She did not put it back on her wrist. She folded it precisely, with the specific military crease that Naomi had noticed 4 months ago and had written into her secondary record, and she placed it in the same pocket as the coin. Solomon's folded sheet went in the right pocket, beside the unread words of 6 people written 8 years ago, in the aftermath of a night they had not expected to survive. She walked to the door. In the corridor outside, as she turned toward the exterior of the building, Caleb appeared from a side hallway and fell into step beside her briefly. He did not look at her. He carried a clipboard and moved with the purposeful quality of someone going somewhere else, which had been his posture all morning. "The handler who burned your Kandahar mission," he said quietly. "He's still active. Pacific Command, different designation, reassigned 8 months ago. I flagged the identification to SOCOM 6 weeks ago under a separate channel. It's in your drive, secondary partition, but I wanted you to know the flag has already been received and is moving." Iris did not stop walking. Her hand at her side formed a fist for 1 beat and released. "How long have you known?" she said. 14 months, he said. "I've been in position at this installation for 14 months, waiting for the operational window." She processed this for 3 steps. "You're not JAG Corps," she said. "No." "SOCOM adjacent?" "Yes," he said. She nodded once. "Thank you, Caleb." "The work was the work, Commander," he said. He turned down the side corridor. She continued to the exterior door alone. The door opened onto the cold and clear November afternoon of Naval Air Station Coronado. Salt air off the bay, the ordinary operational activity of an installation going about its Tuesday business with complete indifference to what had occurred in JAG Building 7 that morning. She stood in the doorway for a moment, in the boundary between the inside and the outside, feeling the cold air and the specific quality of afternoon light, and she stepped through. She walked to the far edge of the installation's main thoroughfare, where the path met the perimeter fence, and the bay was visible beyond it, and she stood for a moment in the full November afternoon. Cold, clear, particular. The water was very blue, the kind of blue that happens only when there is no haze and no softening, when everything is exactly as it appears and the light reveals rather than obscures. She reached into her left pocket, took out the challenge coin, turned it over once, the unit marking, the date, put it back, took out the folded patch and held it in her palm, feeling the familiar weight of the fabric, the specific texture of the material. She thought about what it was and what it had meant to wear it under cover, in plain sight, in a room full of people for 3 hours, without any of them knowing what they were looking at, and what it would mean to wear it differently now, not as camouflage, as the actual thing it was. She folded it back and returned it to the pocket. She would read Solomon's sheet when she was somewhere quiet, somewhere without operational function, where she could sit with what 6 people had written in the aftermath of a night that had changed what they understood about what was possible. Not now. Later, when the day had finished requiring things of her. Her operational phone vibrated. She looked at the screen. The designation was not a name or a number. It was a classification string, the alphanumeric identifier of a communication channel she had been assigned 8 years ago, and that had never, in those 8 years, been marked inactive. The message attached was 7 words. New package, Timeline compressed. When are you available? She looked at the bay, at the cold blue clarity of it, at the aircraft in their patterns above the installation, moving with the quiet precision of things that know exactly where they are going. At the ordinary beautiful afternoon that it held this morning, an extraordinary several hours, and that had continued being an ordinary beautiful afternoon regardless, the way the world does, requiring each person to carry their own portion of significance without asking the world to acknowledge it. She raised the phone to her ear. "Cipher," she said. "Still active." She put the phone in her pocket. She stood in the November light for one more moment. The coin and the patch and the unread words in her left pocket, the folded authorization sheet in her right, the morning's work done and the next work already arriving. And she turned away from the fence and began walking. Behind her, in JAG Building 7, the ordinary institutional sounds continued. Naomi was completing her closeout procedures, the secondary record saved in 3 locations, the official transcript archived in 4, both accounts preserved with the patience of documents that are in no hurry because they are going nowhere. Ethan was working in his office with both folders open, building the legal framework from the public record while the clearance processed, understanding that careful was exactly what the work required, and that he had the time and the intention to be careful. Levi was coordinating the evidence transfer to NCOS headquarters, the chain of custody complete. 31 months of documentation moving through the institutional machinery that would, imperfectly and slowly and genuinely, produce accountability for what had been done to 3 people whose names had been spoken aloud in a formal proceeding for the first time that morning. Lavender Park sat in the gallery a while longer before she stood, put her jacket on, and walked back toward the hospital, toward the evening shift and the floor, and the work that did not pause for anything, which was precisely why it was the right place to be. The investigation would take time. The legal proceedings would be slow. The institutional accounting for long-established malfeasance does not come apart quickly, and the people whose names appear in it have spent careers building the structural redundancies that protect them from exactly this kind of reckoning. But the drive was in 4 archives. The record existed. Ethan was building the case. Naomi's documentation provided continuity. The mechanism, once set in motion, was in motion. 31 days later, Iris sat in a briefing room at SOCOM headquarters and delivered the debrief. 4 hours, precise, complete, carrying the same quality she had brought to JAG Building 7. No more, no less, exactly what each question required. When she finished, Solomon was the last person in the room. He waited until the others had filed out. Then he crossed to the table. "Clean debrief," he said. "Thank you, sir. Are you ready?" She looked at the briefing room, at the institutional furniture, the flag in the corner, the window with its view of an afternoon moving toward evening. She thought about 31 months of a cover identity inhabited so completely that its weight had become indistinguishable from her own, and about the specific sensation of setting it down, the slight, surprised lightness of a body that has been carrying something so long it had forgotten what carrying felt like. She had read Solomon's sheet on the 8th day, in a quiet room, alone, in the evening. 6 people, 6 notes, addressed to a person they had not expected to see again, written in the aftermath of the most dangerous night of their lives. She had read it once carefully, and then she had folded it back precisely along the military crease that Naomi had noticed and put it back in her pocket, where it had been since. "Yes, sir," she said. "I'm ready." "Then welcome back, Lieutenant," Solomon said, "to all of it." She stood. She walked to the door. Outside the briefing room, the hallways of SOCOM headquarters continued their ordinary operational business. Nobody looked at her twice. She was not remarkable in any of the ways that remarkable is expected to look. She walked through the hallways and out of the building and into the evening, clear and cold in the way of late autumn, in a place near water, the dark coming sharp and early, the stars beginning to appear in the sky above the installation, with the clean precision of objects that are exactly where they are supposed to be. She put her hand in her left pocket. The coin was there, the folded patch, the folded sheet that 6 people had written, and 1 had carried, and 1 had finally delivered, 8 years on, to the right hands. The work was waiting. It was always waiting, for the people who had decided to keep doing it, not with urgency and not with patience exactly, but with the simple, permanent fact of its presence, which was all it needed and all it asked. She walked into the evening. Strength that does not require an audience is still strength. Service that goes unrecognized is still service. The people who carry the weight of things that would not exist in the world without them, who carry it through ordinary rooms in ordinary light, who have decided that the work is worth the cost, and prove this decision not once but daily, quietly, without the consolation of being known. These people are not remarkable in the ways we have been taught to recognize remarkable. They look like nurses. They look like people sitting in the back row with notebooks. They look exactly like what they are not, and they are always moving toward the work, toward what comes next, toward the version of themselves that exists not in the cover or the distance or the years of deliberate silence, but in the full and unobstructed fact of who they are and what they have decided to do with it. You may not recognize them when you see them. They have already recognized you. And in the weeks that followed the hearing, the investigation moved the way institutional investigations move when they are working correctly. Slowly, at first, then with the accelerating momentum of documentation confirming documentation, one name leading to the next, each verified timestamp and cross-referenced record, adding its weight to a structure that had been 31 months in the building, and was now at last being built into something the institutional machinery could process and act upon. The medical cases of Corporal David Morrow, Sergeant First Class Teresa Grant, and Petty Officer Second Class James Alton were reopened under independent review 14 days after the hearing. Three families who had been told, through the standard channels of institutional management, that there was nothing to review, received formal notification that the circumstances of their losses were under examination. They were not given details. They were given something more fundamental, the assurance, for the first time, that someone with the authority to look was looking, and that the looking was going to produce an account. For families who had spent months or years accommodating the absence of one, this was not a small thing. It was not enough. It was a beginning. Ethan Walsh received his clearance upgrade 17 days after the hearing, 3 days ahead of standard processing, which he noted without emphasis and did not attach significance to, because he was already deep in the work, and significance was not something he had time to track separately from the work itself. He had spent the 17 processing days building the legal framework from the public record, and when the clearance came through, he had a foundation waiting. He worked with the methodological precision Iris had identified in him, and with the specific energy of someone who has found the work they were made for and does not intend to be anything less than equal to it. He worked late. He worked carefully. He understood that careful and late were exactly what the work required. Naomi's formal witness statement, 8 pages of precisely organized documentation covering 4 months of observation, the secondary record preserved in 3 independent locations, became one of the foundational documents of the NCYS investigation. Levi cited her work in his operational report as the most complete unofficial pre-hearing record his office had encountered in 11 years of similar proceedings. She received a formal commendation 3 months later, routed through official channels with the specific bureaucratic care of an institution acknowledging something it had not been in a position to acknowledge while it was occurring. She put the commendation in a folder on her desk. She continued her work. Sergeant First Class Asher Cole returned to active duty within the month with a modified evaluation that allowed him to continue serving in a training and mentorship capacity with incoming reconnaissance personnel. When people asked him about the Ward 7 Delta hearing, and people asked because things that happen in JAG Building 7 move through an installation the way all contained things move, through the spaces between formal communications, he said it had concluded satisfactorily. He did not elaborate. He had developed over years in service the particular quality of discretion that belongs to people who have witnessed things of significance and understand that significance does not require broadcast to remain real. Fletcher resigned from the JAG Corps 6 weeks after the hearing. He submitted his paperwork quietly, cited personal reasons, and was processed out before the investigation had produced its first formal referral. The investigation found him anyway, which is one of the ways that institutional accountability functions when it functions correctly. The timeline of a person's departure does not determine the timeline of consequence. What is in the record is in the record. Of Kingsley, the process was longer and more deliberate. as it needed to be, as it is always needed to be when the accounting involves senior command and the institutional structures that senior command has spent careers building and reinforcing. The documentation that Iris had assembled was extensive and precisely verified, but the legal architecture of establishing prosecutorial jurisdiction across an investigation that implicated multiple installations and command structures was measured in months and careful steps. It was moving. It would arrive. The drive was in 4 archives, and the record was patient. Lavender Park went back to the hospital that Tuesday afternoon and worked the evening shift in the way she had worked every shift for 7 years, with the full concentration of someone for whom the floor and its patients are the primary facts of any given hour. When her colleagues asked where she had been that morning, she said there had been a hearing and it had concluded. She did not say how. She carried with her in the days and weeks that followed a slightly altered quality of attention. The attention of someone who has learned in a specific and permanent way that the people standing in ordinary rooms might be carrying extraordinary things, and who has decided to hold this knowledge as she moves through her days. It did not make her a different nurse. It made her a more careful person in the particular way that matters most, more careful about what she assumed she knew about the weight other people were carrying. Silas Mercer was gone from the installation by noon on the day of the hearing. He had other places to be in the way that people with his particular kind of work always have other places to be, moving between them with the same quiet occupation that had characterized his presence in JAG Building 7, finding each space and existing in it, leaving it undisturbed, carrying nothing visible into or out of any of them. Caleb was transferred to a different installation 3 weeks after the hearing, under a reassignment order that had been processed before the hearing took place. The order was routine in its form. The timing was what it was. He left the installation the way he had always operated within it, without announcement, without requiring acknowledgement, having done what the work required. Colonel Angela Heather submitted a formal addendum to her testimony within 24 hours of the hearing's conclusion and, through a separate channel, a voluntary request for professional conduct review, covering her role in the pre-hearing preparation period. The review, completed 10 weeks later, found that her conduct reflected institutional pressure rather than deliberate falsification, a distinction that mattered for the specific purposes it mattered for, and that did not restore what the morning had cost, and that Heather accepted with the full understanding of both of these things. She returned to her work, which was the work she was genuinely good at, and she performed it thereafter with an exacting standard of independence that had not characterized it before. The 14 names on the drive moved through a process they had, each in their own way, believed themselves protected from. Not quickly, not easily. With the slow, grinding inevitability of documentation that is precise and patient and durable, that has been built by someone who understood exactly what it would need to withstand and built it accordingly. The process was ongoing. It was real.